Be honest, you suck ass at shooting a shotgun. Me too, it's okay. But there are some things that shotguns are very good for, especially in an SHTF type scenario. And in some of those situations, a semi-automatic is probably a better option than a pump shotgun at this point in time. However, there are some pros and cons to each system. But today we're going to talk about semi-automatic shotguns specifically, because I think in 2025, there's a lot of benefits that they bring that outweigh some of the risks. And this particular shotgun, a Beretta A300 Ultima Patrol, has been very good and is one of those shotguns that could easily take that role for you at a reasonable price point. So let's establish what shotguns are good for as a primary defensive weapon in SHTF, and then we'll talk about the pros and cons of running a semi-automatic shotgun over a pump shotgun for those purposes. Now, I want to say this first. When it comes to SHTF, your primary weapon system should probably be a rifle. An AR-15 or something similar is a much better choice for a fighting primary weapon system than this 12-gauge shotgun. That's because you have a much higher capacity, you have access to longer ranges, much further out than what a 12-gauge can provide. You have an easy manual of arms and a very reliable, robust system that allows you to use whatever accessories you need. So a fighting rifle is generally going to be my first choice when it comes to defensive weapons in an SHTF environment. But there's a couple of things where a shotgun might actually be a better choice if that was a particular role you were taking on. So the first thing I know you're thinking of right now is going to be drones. And yes, I think that they can be effective against drones, but we won't know that time comes until it does. And in the interim, you're not likely going to be choosing a shotgun over a fighting rifle until you realize it's required to defend against drone warfare. So that's one consideration that is there and should be considered, but isn't necessarily a driving primary priority for me. Now, the next thing about shotguns that you're thinking about already, I can just feel it in the middle of the air, just reaching out to me and touching me like some sort of strange person at a convention I've never been to before. And that's going to be breaching. However, you are not a breacher. Have you been trained on how to breach? If so, that's an excellent skill and an excellent ability to afford your group and your community, because most of us have never been trained how to properly do that, and most of us are likely not going to do it in any correct sort of manner, and in general, probably get somebody hurt that we didn't mean to hurt. So, yes, it can be used for breaching, but if you're going to be a breacher, you should know how that works and what you're doing, rather than just saying, well, I have a shotgun, so now I can breach, right? So we got those two out of the way, which I know were the first things we were thinking about. But here's the things that are very reasonable and practical for a full-blown collapse scenario with SHTF written all over it, where you would use a shotgun like this one as your primary weapon versus something like an AR-15. The first thing is going to be checkpoints. If you're running a checkpoint at the end of your driveway at the gate, or a checkpoint at the beginning of your community, where you're checking people in and out and ensuring that they're supposed to be there, and you're on the ground physically there, a 12-gauge shotgun is a good choice for that. And the reason behind that is because they're very good in the sense of being anti-vehicular. A double-aught buck 12-gauge round has a much higher chance of disabling whatever target is inside of a vehicle that you need to immobilize. And that is something that you should definitely consider, because I think checkpoints are something that are a reasonable expectation if things fall apart to a certain degree. You will have to control some level of flow of traffic to remain stable and secure in your community. And that's just the reality of it, especially if it's your property that you're actually trying to protect. Now, shotguns are very good against vehicles. They're going to give you a much higher chance of hitting the target inside, because the material that your projectiles are going to have to go through in order to be effective inside of a vehicle doesn't give you much to work with in the sense of prediction. It's going to do all kinds of different things, and by sending 9 double-aught buck pellets into a vehicle, you're raising the chances that you're going to disable a threat much quicker. So that's one thing I think a shotgun is very good for, that you would use as a primary weapon system in that particular scenario. Now, the other one that I want to bring to your attention that's maybe more practical and less considered in some ways would be for property defense when there is no known threat. Now, what does that mean? That means that if you're out on your property you're working on some stuff, you're in your garden, you're trying to make sure your shed is repaired, or you're out here trying to ensure that things are being taken care of properly, right? And there aren't soldiers on the ground marching your way in that immediacy. And you're trying your best to make sure that things maintain a level of control, but you're not in the middle of a firefight, right? And you still have to get out and take care of business because, well, now we're surviving, it's SHTF. Well, a 12 gauge does a lot for you in that particular position. One, it allows you to defend yourself very well in the sense of having, double out buck or slugs or whatever else it is in order to deter somebody who wants to take an opportunity to attack you. But it also allows you access to the versatility of a 12 gauge shotgun out and about on a property. So now you have access to things like bird shot, where you can go through and maybe make an opportunity hunt all of a sudden, right? And bring some food back home with you. Or you have the ability to do some pest control, and it gives you that wide range of different cartridges that allows you to do any of those things effectively. So that, in my opinion, is what a shotgun is good for during SHTF as a primary weapon system, where I might choose it over something like an AR-15. There's rarely any circumstance where I could assume I'll grab this A300 Ultima Patrol over one of my ARs, just because I'm much more efficient with them, I'm much faster with them, and I can reach out further and put rounds on target more efficiently. And that's just the reality of it, right? And I think that's generally shared by most of us here in this community. But there are those circumstances where a 12 gauge might be a better choice for your primary fighting system. And that's what we just went over. So now we've talked about what shotguns are good for in SHTF. And even in those circumstances, I honestly am at the point where I believe a semi-automatic shotgun that's of high quality and produces a high rate of reliability is better than a pump shotgun for those circumstances. That's just my opinion. And we're going to talk about why here very shortly. But before we get into that, we're going to hear from today's video sponsor. This video sponsor is TacPack. Now, TacPack is a monthly subscription service that sends you all types of accessories and parts that you can try out and stock up on, while also learning about things you might not have known existed before. There are two main tiers. There's a standard tier, which is $60 a month, and a plus tier, which is $140 a month, with a value of $240 to $300. And TacPacks have all kinds of interesting stuff inside of them, including Reptilia PDW pistol grips, Mission First tactical buttstocks, Super Sight adhesive targets, Gen 3 Enforce weapon mounted lights, next level armament AR parts, including a charging handle, safety, as well as an end plate, and even some wacky shit like a Nodzilla t-shirt. And right now, if you use the code MAGIC, not only will you support the channel, but you'll also get a free $60 tactical gift when you sign up with the Plus tier. So make sure you check out TacPack.com, because October's TacPack is worth over $300, which means you're getting a ton of value and a lot of cool stuff from a great company that supports what we do here in this community. All right, big thanks to TacPack for supporting the channel, and make sure you support companies that support the 2A and communities like this one, because there's not a lot of them out there. Now, let's talk about what you need to decide before you jump into a semi-automatic shotgun. And that decision is based on how much time and how much access you have to actually train on this system, which is more complex, whereas a pump shotgun is more simplistic. This shotgun requires you to actually get familiar with the manual of arms and learn how to load it, learn how the system itself works, and how to then operate it once you get ready to go. A pump action shotgun is a little bit easier to get started with, whereas a semi-automatic shotgun is going to be more complex right out of the gate. And then you have to ask yourself if you have somewhere where you can actually shoot a shotgun like this to its full potential. A lot of ranges don't allow you to shoot a shotgun in the way that you would like to in order to find out how it works, how it recoils, and how to actually interact with the gun in the sense of reloads and everything else. If you don't have access to a range where you can do that, it makes getting a semi-automatic shotgun like this one a little more daunting, because you might not ever shoot it to the point where you get comfortable with it. So those are considerations that you need to make ahead of time. And I think most of us can comfortably get used to the manual of arms and figure out how to load a semi-automatic shotgun, because it's not much more difficult than a pump action, but it is slightly more difficult and will take a little bit more energy and effort to get good at. And then we have to decide if we can actually shoot it or take it somewhere we're allowed to really get going on it in order to find out the difference of a semi-auto versus a pump, because there is a significant difference. So, understanding that, if you're still interested in a semi-automatic shotgun, which I think you should be, because they're more efficient in a defensive scenario than a pump action shotgun. And that's why I've switched over to this Beretta A300 Ultima Patrol for a couple reasons. One, because it's semi-automatic, which means it'll provide more efficiency during a defensive scenario, and because this is a high quality, reputable shotgun that actually works and is reliable from personal testing as well as anecdotal evidence. And that's something that I think is very important, because you could go buy a very cheap semi-automatic shotgun and then you'll find yourself in a worse position than if you were to just use a pump action, which is actually going to work. So these are considerations that you have to make. And if you're willing to spend a little extra money and get a decent semi-automatic shotgun, then you'll reap all the benefits of what this brings to the table over a pump action shotgun. And if you like semi-automatic shotguns already and you think Beretta does a pretty good job with them, then hit the subscribe button down below, because, well, I think we're on the same page. So, what are the benefits of the semi-automatic shotgun for preparedness for SHTF type scenarios? Here's the thing, and real quick, just to kind of give you the disclosure, Beretta did send this A300 Ultima Patrol to the channel free of charge upon my request. I asked for it because I wanted to get some time with a semi-automatic shotgun to develop some of the opinions that we're discussing right now. And Beretta's been a friend of the channel for a very long time, so I appreciate them doing that, but you deserve to know that as well, because you might feel that some of the information I'm providing you with is skewed because of that relationship. But in all honesty, I asked for this shotgun because all the anecdotal evidence that's out there says it's highly reliable, and that's been my experience as well. And at the price point that you can find these shotguns at, I don't think you're gonna do better in the sense of reliability compared to value. So just wanted to make sure that was out there. All right, so right here we have the Beretta A300 Ultima Patrol close up. I don't want to get into nitty gritty details or tech specs because that information is easily sourced, but we'll talk about the action and the way I set mine up to give you some ideas in case you're curious. Now this one is unloaded and safe, as you can see, so we're good in that regard. And this is a European style action, so that means a couple different things. First off, it means that your carrier down here is activated by this button. So until you activate that button, if there were rounds in the magazine tube right now, none of them would load. It would just keep doing this, right? And so you press the button, and then it would drop a round down into the carrier, and then you would pull back, and then you would have a round in the chamber to drop in. But right now, because it's empty, it locks the bolt back to the rear, and of course you can use your bolt release to send it forward if you'd like. So, there is something else you should know about this action. And by the way, the magazine tube, it holds 7 rounds of 12 gauge as long as they're 2 3/4 inch, which is pretty solid. Of course, you can ghost load an additional round to have 8, and that's what we're gonna talk about now, ghost loading. So how does ghost loading work? In fact, we'll go ahead and use the 2 3/4 inch shell just to make it a little bit easier. So this is where you can make the shotgun cruiser ready without having anything in the chamber, because shotguns are inherently not necessarily drop safe. And so generally you don't want to have a round in the chamber just all the time, but you want to be able to get one in the chamber quickly without having to fiddle around with buttons like you would on this particular shotgun if you only had rounds in the magazine tube. So how this works is that you pull the bolt back to a certain point where you can fit the shell into the receiver, but without actually having the bolt go all the way to the rear. And in that process, you can push the shell down in the elevator past the point to where the bolt closes forward, and now the shell is still held in the carrier or the elevator, whatever we want to call it, but not in the chamber. And then you would hit this button in order to get that round loaded or ready to be loaded. And now at this point in time, with everything locked up, if you pull back on the bolt, it then rams that round into the chamber. So you would pull the trigger to shoot, and then every subsequent round would automatically load. And that's how you would ghost load this gun in order to have one ready to go, where all you have to do is pull the bolt back and then let it go and you're loaded. So if you want to have the gun cruiser ready, that's how you do that. And then it allows you those other 7 rounds in the tube, which means 8 rounds total, which is pretty solid for a shotgun. Now, the sling attachment point on the buttstock is a point of contention because it's probably not in the best position. And as you can see here, it's on the bottom of the buttstock, and it's generally not where I like to have it, but you can work around it without having to install additional QD swivels in the stock or changing the buttstock in general, but it's just something that you have to be willing to work with. So to explain that, we'll just talk about really quickly how there is a QD sling swivel connection point here at the front of the shotgun on both sides, okay? and that is held on with 2 screws. And yes, you have to tighten it down quite a bit. This is a polymer housing. I know Beretta makes an aluminum one now as well, which is probably more robust, but I haven't had any issues with mine, but I have heard of people having them slide off. So it is something you'd want to watch out for and double check on and retighten on a regular basis. But I have my Blue Force Gear sling. I think this is just a standard Blue Force Gear combat sling. Works very well. I've never had an issue with any of their products. Of course, they are a supporter of the channel now too, which is cool. And then I have that attached up here at the front on my weak side, and then down here at the bottom, right, where nobody really wants it to be, but there it is. So the way you work around this is by pulling the sling up on the outside of the stock, like so, okay? So if I can demonstrate that for you, the way it should look is that it's up on this side of the stock. So it's underneath, pulls up over, and then by doing this, it's pulling that buttstock into your body, while this side of the sling is in the standard, more typical position. So that's how I've worked around it without having to change anything or get any other hardware or something like that to fix the problem. And it's worked very well for me as long as you position the sling this way when you're putting the gun on. But if you allow it to just be at the bottom like this, it's gonna be uncomfortable and uncontrollable and not worth dealing with. So just a little tip, swing it over like this and you'll be much happier with the situation. Okay, so what else do I have on this gun? Here we have iron sights, which these are just like ghost ring peep sights, which are pretty nice with a little bit of high vis fiber optic on the front there. And they work very well. However, it also comes with Picatinny rail, which I then decided to attach a red dot to. Now this is a red dot that I'm testing out. It was sent to me by Strike Industries, and it's called a Hexion Tech Seeker. We also have a 300 series scout light right here on the front, and the handguard has M-LOK on the front of it at the 9 o'clock, the 3 o'clock, and the 6 o'clock. This comes with the hook and loop field that's already pre-cut to the receiver, which I think is very good too, which allows you to use things like these shotgun cards from STAC, which you can then just slap on here, and now I have my reloads ready to go right there on the receiver with me. So if I am doing, you know, some kind of property patrolling or whatnot, I've got another full magazine tube, or at least 6 rounds, not quite 7, but 6 more rounds of 12 gauge on the gun ready to go in case things get weird. So. Damn. That's how we do it. Woo. Now let's talk about the benefits of a semi-automatic shotgun, especially a good one, okay? So, first off, they're very efficient in a defensive situation comparatively to a pump action shotgun. What do I mean by that? So, with a semi-automatic shotgun, you can stay on your target between shots. With a pump action, in between each shot, you have an activated motion that you have to accomplish in order to get the next round into the chamber. And very often that takes you off of your target, or at the very least creates additional thought processes that have to then sound off while you're in the middle of a defensive situation. So understand that you can stay on target easier with a semi-automatic shotgun than a pump shotgun. Not to mention, because of having those follow-up shots be much faster, there's less time between the end of a threat and the final shots of an encounter. And this is something that was provided to me by a law enforcement friend regarding the statistics of putting threats down. And with the semi-automatic shotgun, you're putting the threat down faster because the shots are coming up quicker and there's just less time in between the beginning of the threat and the end of the threat with this system comparatively to a pump shotgun because of that need for a manual motion. Now, there's also something very important regarding a semi-automatic shotgun in comparison to a pump shotgun regarding an actual encounter, and that's shifting the risk from engagement to operation of the weapon. What does that mean? Okay, so a semi-automatic shotgun is harder to get up and running in the sense of getting it loaded, getting it prepped, and learning the manual of arms and understanding how it all works. But when you're actually shooting it, and when you're in that defensive situation, you now have less risk during that engagement because all you have to do is turn off the safety and pull the trigger, right? And once you pull the trigger, you just pull it again until you don't have any shells left or until the threat is stopped. With a pump action shotgun, the risk is in the operation of the shotgun itself during the engagement. So while you're in this defensive situation, you have to mentally be prepared to continually operate that pump action in a efficient manner in order to ensure that you don't short stroke it or create a malfunction in between shots while you're still trying to remain on target and have threat level focus. So a semi-automatic basically says, look, during the engagement, this is going to be easier and it's going to be more effective. A pump action says, before the engagement, this is going to be easier and more effective. Which one do you think is better in a defensive situation with that thought process in mind? So that's one of the things that a semi-automatic does better than a pump action shotgun, and that's one of the main benefits of running something semi-automatic for defensive purposes over a pump. Before we get into the negatives of a semi-auto, I just want to say that yes, for a long-term austere environment SHTF scenario where you're walking through the woods for the rest of your life, randomly hunting a squirrel or a bird in order to feed yourself and potentially defending yourself, yeah, a pump action, manual action shotgun is likely to last longer without maintenance and without cleaning. That is likely true. However, how many rounds are we going to go through in those scenarios? And how many rounds are we going to go through in a defensive scenario with a 12-gauge shotgun? And the honest answer there is that you're likely not going to be able to carry enough 12-gauge ammunition with you to shoot this enough times to get it to the point where it stops working. So it doesn't really make a huge difference. But it is something that is true technically. A pump action will last longer with less maintenance and less cleaning because of the manual action. But I think in the sense of what we consider during SHTF, that's unlikely to matter, right? Especially during a defensive situation. How many rounds are you going to get back in this gun before you are out of ammo? Definitely not enough to shut this thing down, at least in my experience so far. So, wanted to mention that. Now, what are the negatives of running something like the A300 Ultima Patrol compared to like a pump shotgun, okay? Well, first off, you have the requirement to learn the manual of arms and the complexity of the system. Not only do you have to learn how to load this thing, not only do you have to learn how to ghost load it if you want to have an additional round in, well, I guess on the carrier and then have it cruiser ready so it's easier to get into battery and ready to go when something comes up. But at the same time, you also have to learn how to field strip it, clean it, take it apart, and everything else related to ensuring it runs reliably. So there is a lot more complexity there. And that's going to need more time and focus and hands-on experience to become very proficient with this particular weapon compared to a pump shotgun, okay? So that's just the truth. And cleaning and maintenance and everything else is going to be more technical, right? Breaking this thing down and cleaning it, it's a little bit of a job. And it's, well, not something that you're going to easily do out in the field, in all honesty. But it can be done in the sense of maintaining it and keeping it clean. You're just going to have to put more effort in and understand the limitations of what you can do where you are, depending on what you have access to. And then, of course, you're going to have to do that more frequently than with a pump shotgun to ensure that the system is still working reliably. So all those considerations are there, and those are the negatives. But those negatives are pretty easily overcome if you're willing to spend the time and just get used to this particular platform rather than just writing it off because you don't want to deal with it, right? Which is a decision you can make, by the way, if you decide to, because at that point, I mean, fine, just stick to the pump shotgun and that's fine with me. Although I will say this, personally, I find even shooting a pump shotgun way more difficult than this. And it just is, because you have to manually cycle that action and it has a less intuitive form and function to it. Because with a pump shotgun, you're doing a push-pull type situation when you fire the gun. The semi-automatic shotgun, it's more intuitive because it's just like any other long arm that you currently own where you just pull it back into your shoulder and let loose, right? So to me, that's a lot easier in the sense of being intuitive. So those are the negatives, which I don't think are that big of a deal in all honesty, but it is something worth discussing, right? Now, I also will say another negative to a semi-automatic shotgun is price point, because you are going to spend more no matter what. And if you are broke, right? Or if you just don't want to spend a lot of money on a shotgun because you don't think you're going to use it very often and you just want it for utilitarian purposes, which I would completely understand, because like I said at the beginning of this video, an AR-15 or something similar to it is a better choice for defensive situations than SHTF. But if you don't have a lot of money, but you want a shotgun, you are better off buying a pump action shotgun. That's my opinion. Something like a Maverick 88 is an excellent option for, you know, $200 to $300 or whatever they cost. I don't even know, but all I'm trying to say is they're very inexpensive in comparison to something like this semi-automatic shotgun, and you can't rely on an ultra cheap semi-automatic shotgun. I wouldn't want to do that. Just because you can buy a semi-auto shotgun at the same price as a Maverick 88 doesn't mean it's a good idea. It means the Maverick 88 is a higher quality firearm because the price point basically dictates that at that point in time, and that semi-auto for the same price is likely not going to last and not going to be reliable and not going to be something you're going to want to mess with during an SHTF event. That's my opinion. So another negative here is how much these cost in comparison and how you can get very high quality pump action shotguns for a lot less money. And that's just the truth. So make sure you consider that as well, because that's the reality of it, right? Now, which, by the way, I'm a Mossberg guy when it comes to pump action. So if you're gonna get a pump action, I don't think there's anything wrong with a 500, just throwing that out there. Sorry, Beretta, but for semi-autos, I like this. Now, let's talk about a couple of things just to wrap this whole conversation up, but to really drive home the main point at the end of this video that I think is important, okay? First off, pump versus semi. Pump action, the complexity is during the use of the gun in a defensive situation. You have to manually cycle the action. That's the complex part. That means that you're now using brain power to cycle your weapon and to fight that you shouldn't necessarily need to be using when there are other options that can do that part for you, right? So that's pump action. Semi-automatic, the complexity is prior to use, prior to the engagement. The complexity is loading the system, getting everything prepped and primed, cleaning and maintaining the system, right? That's where the complexity comes in on the semi-auto. But during the part where you're defending your life and during the part where there's an actual threat to your life, this one is less complex. This one becomes the simplistic one, the semi-auto, whereas the pump becomes the complicated one during that particular moment. And that's a big consideration, I think, when we're talking about using these as weapons, not as bird hunting tools or as skeet shooting tools, whatever else you want to use your shotgun for. But when we're talking about using them as weapons to defend ourselves, the complexity being in the engagement is probably not the best way to go. So, the big takeaway though, that you need to get from this video, more than anything else, shotguns, pumps, manuals, semi-autos, whatever it is, right? If you get a shotgun for self-defense purposes, no matter what action you use, they all require training to get proficient with. And the reality is, I'm not proficient with this gun. Not to the level of what I should be if I actually chose to use this as my primary weapon system. Can I get good with it? Sure. Do I have the ability to do that? I do. Are some of you out there who are avid bird hunters already good with a shotgun? Yeah, I bet. And I'm sure you're better at manipulating your shotgun than I am. And so this might be a better option for you already. But the reality is, if you want to use a shotgun defensively, you're going to need training and you're going to need some instruction because they're not easy to use. They're very limited on capacity, and especially pump shotguns aren't something that I personally feel should be advocated to people who have zero experience. They're one of the harder systems to use correctly and one of the harder systems to use efficiently. Everything seems simple on paper and everything works the way it's supposed to, of course, but a new shooter already struggles with things as simple as a semi-automatic pistol, right? Even something as simple as a Glock. But for some reason, we assume that they can handle cycling a pump action shotgun with a lot of recoil and a lot of noise in a risky, threatening situation, all while having zero experience, and expect that to just work out, I guess, right? And the reality is that that's just not gonna happen. Does it happen? Sure. Do people end threats all the time with guns without any training at all? Yes. Do we want to use that point as an argument to try to say you shouldn't train? I would assume not, right? So, choose wisely. But in my opinion, it's 2025. We have these A300 Ultima Patrol by Beretta. This gun, I've had zero hiccups with, 100% reliable, and they're relatively affordable for what they are. And I think at this point in time, if you're really worried about self-defense with a shotgun, I don't think you can beat semi-automatic.